Terence Crawford says that Errol Spence Jr. isn't a Hall of Famer because he's only really fought in one division, and that's basically all he's done. You know, he's had a lot of great fights, obviously, but fighting in one division doesn't make you great. Moving up in weight classes and accomplishing different things in different weight classes what really makes you great, in Terence Crawford's opinion. And it's an interesting topic because obviously we know that Spence and Crawford was the mega fight. It took like 3 to 4 years to really get that fight to fruition and have it as a done deal. It was a difficult fight to make from the sport of boxing's negotiation perspective. We all know that because we had waited for it. We heard it was on, it was off, and then it was back on. So once we saw the fight, we saw Terence Crawford do his thing, and ultimately that was Terence Crawford's biggest win of his career, right? Not probably his most difficult fight, but definitely his biggest win of his career when it comes to his resume. That's the best fighter that Terence Crawford has fought. But if you look at it, it wasn't a competitive fight, and then you hear Terence Crawford saying that Spence isn't a pound for pound Hall of Famer. Ultimately, he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame because he's only been in one division his entire career. So I don't know if that's fair, because ultimately Spence accomplished a lot. You know, some fighters take care of business in their own weight class. They don't feel that moving up in weight or down in weight in different weight classes, being champion in different weight classes, is that important. It's more so, you know, fighting the best wherever the case may be, even if that means staying at 147. And that's what Spence did. He beat a lot of good fighters at 147. It's just interesting to hear Crawford say that, because if your biggest win is against Spence and you're saying that he's not a Hall of Famer, does that make you a Hall of Famer? Because you guys have some common opponents, right? You have Kell Brook, you have Sean Porter. So ultimately, is Crawford a Hall of Famer too? I think Crawford's a Hall of Famer, but I think Spence is a Hall of Famer too. You know, I think Spence has accomplished a lot at 147. Just because, you know, you ultimately beat him bad, I feel like that was your hallmark win. You know, that wasn't your most difficult fight, but that was your biggest name on your resume. Errol Spence, you could argue, you know, Amir Khan maybe, but ultimately that was the fight where you two were the top at 147, and we really wanted to see what was going to happen. And now that you're saying that, you know, Errol Spence wasn't or isn't a Hall of Famer, does that mean that, you know, you're a Hall of Famer? It's just, should we take credit away from your win against him because he's only been at that division? Was he wagering then because he's only been at that division? It's just like, if you're going to discredit him in general, it kind of takes away from your win as well, because if you're saying that he's only fought in one division his entire career after, you know, being in a car crash, 2 car crashes, the detached retina, does that mean that we should take that into account as well? You know, like for Crawford, he's going to have to take the good and the bad, because ultimately he did have a terrific performance. But if he himself is saying that Spence isn't a Hall of Famer, then you didn't beat a Hall of Famer. And if that's your biggest win, you know, you can say you moved up in multiple weight classes and, you know, you've accomplished a lot. Because I still feel like Crawford's a generational talent. I think Crawford's top 2 pound for pound right now. It has to be him or Inouye, in my opinion. But to say that Spence isn't a Hall of Famer just makes me think, like, so you didn't beat a Hall of Famer in your biggest fight. In your best win, you weren't even fighting a Hall of Famer. That's what Terence Crawford is saying. So it's just weird. You know, how can he be a Hall of Famer but Spence isn't? I understand, you know, he moved up multiple weight classes, started at 35, which is impressive, and is going up to Canelo, you know, to fight him at 168. I get that, but I still think Spence is, you know, Hall of Fame status. I just feel like just because he took a beating to you know, that was his only loss. And all his other fights, he's been able to best, you know, some of the best 147 pounders in the world. So I just don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair to say that Spence isn't a Hall of Famer. I can respectfully disagree with Terence Crawford, and I'm excited to see what Bud does at 168, because, you know, and Crawford's doing a great thing by, you know, doing all these interviews and saying how he feels. You know, boxing fans are getting and gaining a little bit more of his perspective on how he feels about, you know, guys like Errol Spence, fighters like Manny Pacquiao. But ultimately, it's interesting because how are we going to know, you know, who he takes seriously? Is, you know, Canelo's obviously a Hall of Famer. So once he fights Canelo, is that his only Hall of Fame, you know, caliber fighter that he's going to ever fight? And if he loses to him, does that mean he's not a Hall of Famer? It's just, you know, Hall of Fame is so subjective, but I personally feel like Crawford's in the Hall of Fame, Spence is in the Hall of Fame. Just because he's at 147 his entire career doesn't mean he can't be a Hall of Famer. I thought, you know, he had a long run and he did great throughout his career, even if we never see Spence again. But let me know down below what you guys think. Is Spence Hall of Fame? I think so, but let me know down below. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you guys on the next Nabs boxing video. Peace.